Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some training camp cuts that the San Jose Sharks have made over this weekend. I talked about the possibility of this occurring in my previous game review, and indeed it ended up being the case. A couple of days ago, they announced a more minor set of cuts with players like Haché and Van Roboys, but today they announced a more major set of cuts where some more significant names actually got sent back down. Now, this will not be an exhaustive list. I'm not going to be talking about every single player who ended up getting dropped from the training camp roster, but instead the more notable names. And we start off with the most notable name of them all, Quentin Musty, right here at the top. He's also the only player, today at least, who got sent back down to juniors, because it is an unfortunate reality for Quentin Musty that he is ineligible to actually play with the San Jose Barracuda this season. So instead, he heads back to the Sudbury Wolves in the OHL, whose season, by the way, has actually just started recently over these last few days. Now, there were some hopes coming into training camp and preseason that Musty would actually be able to make his NHL debut, at the very least get that sort of 9-game stint prior to burning a year off of their entry-level contract. And after a very impressive showing in the albeit very uncompetitive development camp scrimmage in early July, there was definitely a lot of hype around this player. At the rookie face-off tournament, he was relatively up and down. Game 2, he had a hat-trick. Game 3, he finished strong, but Game 1 wasn't that great. However, it was really the preseason that put a break on the Quentin Musty hype train. It was 2 preseason games where, sure, he didn't play with the best of the best talent that the San Jose Sharks had to offer, but it was quite clear that he was just a little bit too slow, and considering that preseason is not even at the general pace of an NHL regular season game, it's quite clear Musty wasn't ready to make that jump, and so he does indeed get sent back down. It is an unfortunate situation with the rules where he has to go back to juniors, a place where he has already accomplished a lot individually. He led the league last season in terms of points per game. It wouldn't be that much of a surprise if he was able to repeat that performance this season as well. But there can still be some things to strive for. Obviously, winning like an OHL championship with Sudbury could be something, winning the Memorial Cup. And of course, last year we know Quentin Musty was actually snubbed from making it onto the World Juniors team at the Under-20 tournament near the end of December and into early January. This year, it seems as though he's more or less a lock to be able to get there, and so he'll try and win a championship as well. So there are some things still that Musty can strive for, but of course, obviously the Sharks would have loved to have him with the Barracuda, but again, those are the rules. Then we get to Kasper Halttunen, another player sent down, but unlike with Musty, Halttunen was eligible to make his professional debut, and it seems as though that's exactly what's going to happen. There was a decision that needed to be made because he could definitely have gone back to the OHL to play with the London Knights. Now, prior to the rookie face-off tournament, I was leaning towards an AHL debut. Then after the tournament, I was leaning more so towards heading back to juniors. But it seems as though over these last few days, that preseason game that he participated in which he actually looked quite good, was the decision-making point for Grier to say that he is ready to make that jump to the professional level. Now, there are positives and negatives about this decision. The positives, of course, are that he remains under the San Jose Sharks umbrella. He gets to stay in San Jose. He's around the teammates that he has spent a lot of time with over these last couple of weeks, players like Bjorkstrand and Cardwell, these types of guys. And so, since the Sharks will be able to have a more heavy hand in his development, that could definitely be a boost to him. On the other side, though, there are some negatives. Had he gone back to the OHL, he would have played a significant role with the London Knights, likely as a top 6, if not top line player, number 1 power play guy, and since the London Knights are a very successful franchise as well, he could have perhaps made a deep playoff run and into the Memorial Cup. With the San Jose Barracuda, considering the Sharks are hopeful that the Barracuda are going to be significantly better than they have been these last couple of seasons, they'll have some bigger name players playing up in the lineup, and it's possible that Halttunen will find himself more so like a third liner or even a fourth liner, or perhaps even a healthy scratch at times. And so the fact that he's going from big minutes in juniors to playing slightly smaller minutes here in the AHL makes this more of a weighted decision of pros and cons, but at the end of the day, Mike Grier makes the call, decides to keep him at the professional level, and we'll see what Halttunen is able to do with that. Then we get to Filip Bjorkstrand. Now, it's not really much of a surprise to see Bjorkstrand get cut. It was always part of the development plan. Last year, he was playing in the SHL. finished that season, played a few games with the Barracuda at the end of it. This year, it was expected he'd play in the AHL the entire year, and then next year could be the season where he could make that jump. Still, you were hoping for at least some solid performances throughout the training camp, simply because of the fact that he is still technically a former first rounder, and especially at the rookie faceoff tournament being a 2022 first rounder, he is slightly older than a decent chunk of the other players there for San Jose. He wasn't great at the rookie faceoff tournament, but the saving grace came in this preseason. He played one game, looked really strong in that one, and so there is definitely still hope that he can remain on this development path and perhaps be like a third line center for the San Jose Sharks into the future. He'll likely be a big name for the Barracuda this year. Then we get to Tristen Robins and Brandon Coe, who I will actually talk about in tandem here because they're both in very, very similar situations. Both of them were drafted back at the 2020 NHL entry draft by former general manager Doug Wilson, Robins in the second round, Coe in the fourth round, and it was at a time in which the Sharks prospect pool was not remotely impressive. These days, many people would say that the Sharks have the best prospect pool in the NHL, but 4 years ago, many people would have argued that the Sharks had the worst prospect pool in the entire league. And so us as Sharks fans, we tried to make do with what we had, and so we kept a close eye on how Robins and Coe were doing through their junior league journeys. And indeed, they had successful seasons, at least as overagers, but making the transition to the AHL has not been all that easy for them. Robins, at least a couple of years ago, had a decently offensively productive season, but this past season, through a combination of injuries as well as just steps back he has taken, it hasn't gone nearly as well. Meanwhile, for Brandon Coe, he hasn't even taken any sort of steps forward. He's been pretty ineffective for the Barracuda for the last 2 years, and so at this point, both of these prospects are likely on their last legs. Not only are they not drafted by Mike Grier, so he doesn't really have any sort of favoritism for these two players, but now 4 years removed from their draft years, they've been heavily leapfrogged by pretty much every other draft prospect at this point. And so if they're not able to make much of an impact at all with the Barracuda, and it's possible that they'll be in and out of the lineup this season anyway, they probably don't have much else hope with this organization. It would likely take a miracle for them to actually get a second look here. Their time with San Jose is probably done. Then we move on to Jake Furlong. As I mentioned in my preseason review, in the game that he played, he looked rather solid, but he's a defenseman who doesn't necessarily get a lot of hype around him because of the fact that he doesn't have those two major factors that get a lot of people talking about prospects. He doesn't have the big point totals like a Luca Cagnoni that jump off the page, but he also doesn't have the high draft pick pedigree of like a Sam Dickinson, where as an 11th overall pick, people talk about you, people hype you up. With Furlong as a 5th round pick in 2022, not a ton of excitement on paper for him. Yet, he's been making some very steady progress over these last couple of seasons in his development. He played at the World Juniors with Team Canada this past season, and in his one preseason game, he looked very poised, he looked very composed, he played a solid defensive game, very Marc-Edouard Vlasic-esque, and so now heading to the San Jose Barracuda for this season, over this next year as well as the following one, he could look to make some strong steps forward developmentally to become a defensive defenseman for the San Jose Sharks in the future. He certainly has the tools to be able to pull that off. And then finally, we have the goaltender for the Sharks, Romanov. Now, his future with the team seemed rather clear, at least a few weeks ago, in a situation in which Askarov indeed managed to make it to the NHL and the Sharks decided to run with 3 goalies. Romanov could be the starter with the San Jose Barracuda, or worse comes to worse in his situation, if Askarov did not make it to the NHL and instead was the starter for the Barracuda, Romanov could at least be the backup and get 20 to 25 games. However, over these last couple of days, the Sharks have decided to give an AHL contract to Aaron Dell, a decision that I don't technically hate, because if the Sharks do sustain an injury or perhaps even a couple of injuries at goaltending position for this season, they would need someone like Dell to help fill in a bit. I am just hopeful that Romanov will be given the priority over someone like Dell when it comes to actually getting minor league games when they are fully healthy, as long as, of course, Romanov does keep up a solid performance, which he has been good. He's played a preseason game. He was very good in the win against the Anaheim Ducks there, participated at the rookie faceoff tournament. He was also equally solid, so it seems as though he is ready for at least a somewhat increased workload with the San Jose Barracuda this season, and indeed, like I said, I do hope he gets the advantage over someone like Dell, because in 3 to 4 years' time, who's to say that he's not going to be the backup for someone like Askarov? I can certainly say there's a more likely chance of that happening than Aaron Dell being in that role, so it is still a goaltending prospect that the Sharks do want to have some focus on here. Then we move on to the players who have been kept around, the players who survived these sets of training camp cuts. Now, this does not necessarily mean that they will be making it to the roster to start the year. In fact, the vast majority of them will still likely end up getting set down over these next few days, but it is still notable that the Sharks decided to keep them on the roster to get that extra game or perhaps even extra 2 games for them in the preseason and to keep a closer eye on them. And we start off with Danil Gushchin, perhaps the only player on this list who actually has a good shot of making it to the starting roster. He has been very, very impressive, perhaps the Sharks' best player over this preseason, really only competitive with, I'd say, Macklin Celebrini, and the fact that Gushchin has played 2 games instead of Celebrini's 1 does give him a bit of a leg up in that area. Gushchin has been so good. He's looked outstanding, and it feels as though he should have a spot penciled into the lineup. I know people talk about, well, the Sharks, they have so many of these these one-way contracts. How could you justify having Gushchin over someone like Dellandrea and Grundstrom? You don't want to send them down because you don't want to put them on waivers, things like that. But at this point, if Mike Grier was actually serious when he said that this was going to be a competition this year and that it was going to be a situation of if you played well, you would earn a lineup spot, Gushchin could not have possibly played any better technically. Obviously, there's always a ceiling that is able to be hit, but realistically, he could not have played much better than he has. He's been far and away better than both Grundstrom and Dellandrea, and also Cunnin and Goodrow, and really a lot of these players. So at this point, if he somehow doesn't make it into the lineup, it will kind of invalidate a lot of the messaging that Mike Grier has been having about this team, where it is indeed an open competition, and it's not just a situation where the veterans get the advantage, because like I said, Gushchin could not have possibly played any better than he has already through a couple of games. Then we get to Ethan Cardwell. Now, as I said, Cardwell will likely get sent back down over these next few games, but because of a very strong rookie face-off tournament as well as a very impressive most recent preseason game for himself, the Sharks do want to get that extra close look at him. Who could blame them? Cardwell was really good with the Barracuda this past season, and while he likely will not be making it to the NHL this year, outside of maybe a game or 2 near the end of the season if the Sharks are feeling generous, it is still likely to be a step forward year this season for Cardwell with the Barracuda, and it'll be next year where he'll look to sort of break that barrier, kind of like with Philip Bystedt, to be able to make a spot in the Sharks' bottom 6. He clearly has all of the tools to make that happen. He's a very, very hard-working player, decent offensive instinct, good use of his body, maybe not quite at the NHL level, but he's getting there for sure. And so there's a lot to like here about this player, and I'm very happy that he's going to be given at least that extra preseason game to see further what he is capable of, and hopefully he gets indeed into another position where he can succeed, like in the previous one where he was matched with Gushchin. Then we get to Colin Graf. Graf is sort of in an interesting spot because coming into this season, there was certainly a possibility that he could make it to the NHL starting lineup for the Sharks because he played a few NHL games near the end of last season after being signed out of the NCAA. The problem here with Graf is that the fact that a player like Gushchin is still technically a question mark to be able to make it the roster, and the fact that Gushchin is quite squarely ahead of Graf on the Sharks depth charts makes this a pretty insurmountable task for Graf to actually be able to do so. And so while he will be kept around here to get at least another preseason game, it is very, very likely that in the future, over these next few days, he does get sent back down and he will instead play a significant role with the San Jose Barracuda. It's not the end of the world for Graf's career. There are still, many things to look forward to over these next couple of seasons for himself, but NHL prospects likely have faded at this point. Then we get to the defensive side of things, where a few notable names were kept around, and we start off with Luca Cagnoni. While Gushchin has likely been the Sharks' best forward and really all-around best player, Cagnoni has probably been the Sharks' best defenseman over this short preseason, over these last 3 games. He's just been high-flying everywhere along the ice, but unlike with Gushchin, he doesn't really have as much of a high chance of actually being able to make it to the NHL roster this season. Don't get me wrong, he's made significant strides in his development. A few weeks ago, had you asked me where I thought Cagnoni would play this season, I would have probably said with the Portland Winterhawks in the WHL, but the fact that now he's not only making his professional debut, but he's likely to be a big name and a big player for the Barracuda this season, this means he's like 2 years at least ahead of the expected development path for him. But still, NHL ready, likely a little bit out of reach, especially with the sort of more established names that the Sharks do have on their roster, plus a player like Mukhamadullin, who also probably finds himself above Cagnoni on the depth charts, but still very, very excited for this player. He's been so good. He'll get another preseason game, maybe another couple of preseason games before getting sent back down. He's definitely going to be someone to watch this year. Then we get to Sharks defenseman Sam Dickinson. Now, he's kind of been the opposite of Cagnoni. While Cagnoni's looked really impressive through 2 games, Dickinson, well, let's just say, has not looked very impressive over these 2 games. The fact that he hasn't been sent back down to the OHL like with Quentin Musty, considering, like I said, the season in the OHL has started very, very recently, tells me not so much that they're excited about what Dickinson has done and are very anxious to be able to get him some more games, but more so that since he's that 11th overall pick, the Sharks have put a lot of faith and a lot of stock into this player. They want to try and get him as much NHL exposure as possible to try and get him into that feeling of being an NHL player. Also, perhaps hoping to actually get him a decent NHL preseason game to build up some confidence, because I'm sure if I personally and us fans have seen that Dickinson has not looked good over these games, I imagine the coaching staff and Dickinson himself have also realized that very same fact. So to try and build him some confidence with at least one decent preseason game is probably what they're looking to do. He will eventually get sent back down. There's literally zero chance he actually makes it into the NHL, and we'll see what he's able to do in the junior leagues this season. And then finally we have Jack Thompson, who is sort of creating some separation with the other 2 for the very simple fact that he is a right-handed defenseman. Most of the Sharks' defensive prospects, Thrun, Mukhamadullin, Cagnoni, Dickinson, Furlong even, are all left-handed. Thompson stands sort of on his lonesome here as a right-handed guy. So while the Sharks do have 3 right-handed players to play in the NHL this year, Benning, Ruda, and Cody Ceci, Thompson, in a way, is sort of like the next man up. Now, imagine if an injury were to occur on the right side, the Sharks would probably just have someone play on their offside, like Thrun, who we've seen do that in the preseason thus far, and then Mukhamadullin or Vlasic would step into the empty spot. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that Thompson is very, very close to making it to the NHL, but the fact that he does have that uniqueness to him as being a right-handed defenseman gives him an advantage in the sort of Sharks depth charts. And through the 2 preseason games that he has played, he's looked rather good. Not as good as Cagnoni, but certainly not as bad as Sam Dickinson either. So the Sharks will likely look to give him at least another game, maybe another couple of games, and then send him back down to the Barracuda, where he'll be one of the Barracuda's top defensemen this year. But that will do it for this training camp cut review. Over these next few days, we shall see more and more cuts come in as the Sharks narrow down their starting roster fully. And of course, we are getting closer and closer to the long-anticipated start of this very exciting regular season. Class dismissed.